Let's stay in South Australia, though. Speaking of South Australia, and go to a great columnist, a great young columnist for the Advertiser newspaper, Caleb Bond. You see him regularly here on Sky News, especially with Gleeso looking at the next day's news. Good to talk to you again, Caleb. A cracking column you wrote today, pointing out that the state of emergency still exists in South Australia. Now, we know it exists in some other states as well. But in South Australia, it's extraordinarily onerous. You effectively have the police commissioner still in charge of the state, 14 months into a pandemic.
That's right. I mean, you know, people use the term in a pejorative sense, but it is the very definition of a police state. The police commissioner, Grant Stevens, basically has ultimate control of the state. He can walk into any property he likes under the emergency declaration in South Australia. He can seize any property he likes. He can order anyone he likes to stay in a hotel or at home. They can't move around. I mean, these are all provisions that I think most people understand were required of someone, whether that be the police minister or another leader, at some point in the pandemic. But, you know, this was March last year these rules came into being. And we are now 13 months later. They are still there. They will come up for review again next month. But the governor has basically just every 28 days rubber stamped the continuation of a police state in South Australia. And I think we are seriously at the point where we have to ask the question, why does the police commissioner need to have ultimate control of South Australia? There is no emergency anymore. We've not had a case of community transmission of coronavirus for months in South Australia. There is next to no coronavirus in the whole country. There is no emergency. So how can we continue to say that we need a state of emergency in SA or any other state for that matter?
Look, the situation is we've seen police overreach in other states, certainly in New South Wales, extensively in Victoria, and there's been argument about the extension of emergency powers in Victoria. But you summed it up so pithily there, Caleb. In South Australia, there is no emergency, yet a place where you lock down half of the state in November last year, and where you've had borders closed quite extensively throughout the pandemic on and off. Those decisions have effectively been made by the Commissioner. The Premier and the Chief Health Officer have had their input, but it's been the Police Commissioner making the decisions.
Well, let's not forget that South Australia locked out its own residents if they were stuck in Victoria. They were not allowed to come over and visit dying relatives. They weren't allowed to come over if they had an important exam, all sorts of things like this. And I think you're right. I mean, the real question here is whether or not these powers ought to be vested in an unelected man, i.e. the Police Commissioner, Grant Stevens. I mean, what we've seen for the last 12, 13, now 14 months is the Premier Stephen Marshall basically taking a back seat and allowing the state to be run by Police Commissioner Grant Stevens and Chief Public Health Officer Nicola Spurrier. Now, in any other case, the way the public service works is that government departments give advice to politicians, to premiers and ministers. Ministers then take that advice, weigh it up against advice they received from other quarters and what they think the public will accept. And they then make a decision based on what they think is best for the state. What we've done for the last year is completely cut out that middleman, which is the politician, who is elected by us to make decisions on behalf of us and put the control of the state in the hands of unelected bureaucrats. Now, if that's what we're going to continue doing, you may as well blow up Parliament House. We don't need that anymore. We don't need politicians. We'll just have the whole place run by unelected bureaucrats. And if we did that, I mean, you know, you'd have to rip out every piece of play equipment in the state because, of course, from a public health perspective, a kid might fall off the monkey bars and break their arm. And we can't have that. That's not OK. That's unsafe, which is exactly what SA Health tried to say a couple of months ago. We couldn't go from the 4 square metre rule to the 2 square metre rule. And then SA Health resisted going from 2 square metres to 75% capacity. You had to get Grant Stevens, the Police Commissioner, to overrule SA Health on that matter. I don't think these are decisions that ought to be made by the Police Commissioner. They are basically political decisions at the end of the day. Why is the Premier not stepping up and taking charge of the state? Why is the Police Commissioner still basically in charge of South Australia?
You are so spot on, Caleb. That is such an articulate and rational and reasoned argument about a mad situation. Yet why is it that a columnist for the Adelaide Advertiser is the only person making these points? The state opposition won't make those points. The other politicians won't. You're just living in this ridiculous state of emergency with no coronavirus in the state. Thanks for joining us, Caleb. Well done.
Thank you, mate.
Who could disagree with Caleb Bond? This is an outlandish situation. The police commissioner is still in control of the great state of South Australia because of an emergency. There's no coronavirus. People are being vaccinated. The vulnerable are getting their vaccines. And the police commissioner is in charge. It's politics, pure and simple, because these state premiers think they look tough because they're keeping the evil germ out. And I predict this ridiculous situation will go on until the next election in South Australia. What a shambles.